Hey everyone, in this tutorial we're gonna dive in Houdini and we're gonna create our frost projectile. So let me isolate that mesh for you so we could have a closer look. As you can see here, I've got this mesh that we're gonna create in Houdini. We're gonna come up with some very basic shapes first. We're gonna run it through couple noises, turn that into VDB and come up with some game mesh resolution to make sure that it's not too high poly. And at the end, we're just gonna create some UVs for it and the second UV channel so we can have a glow, as you can see here in the front. We're gonna generate some UVs for it as well so we can actually apply some textures. Although in that example, I'm just using tileable noise textures to get that kind of look in Unreal Engine. Okay, so let's dive to Houdini now and let's create some meshes for our projectile. So here's what we'll be creating now. As you can see, we've got a lot of details here and the mesh poly count is actually 1.5 thousand polygons or 4.5 thousand vertices. Okay, you can knock it down even further if you want with this poly reduced node, but let's start from scratch. I'm going to disable this one, tab, geometry. I'm gonna go with geometry node. I'm gonna rename this to Frost Projectile YouTube. Dive inside and I'm gonna start with line. I'm gonna enable points here so I can actually see how many points I've got. And I'm gonna add box here. I'm gonna use next copy to points node. And as you can see, we should get two boxes. Because what we're doing, essentially, we're copying that box onto those points. However, I'm just going to scale it down a bit and I need more points. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to run this line through resample node. I'm going to enable it. As you can see, we're getting a lot more points. I'm just going to enable maximum segments so I can control how many points I actually want there. And we're going to go with 5. Next things, I want to actually randomize the scale of it. So I'm going to run this resample node through the attribute randomize. If I plug this in, we can see we're getting at random colors. This is not what we want. We want a p-scale attribute. Then I'm going to maybe randomize it between 0.5 and 1. Next, I would like to have a random rotation. So another attribute randomize. Plug it in, change the CD, which is color, to orient. I'm gonna go with 4 dimensions and we're getting random rotation. I'm gonna 0 everything so I can pick and choose which axis I want to randomize on. I'm gonna maybe randomize on this one. How about that one? Definitely not. We probably want to need slight rotation on this axis. And this one, yeah, we can go from 1 to 0 or 0 to 1. And this one as well will be low value. So let's start with maybe 0.05 and minus 0.05. Same on this one. And we're getting slight rotation. Okay, next thing, I'm gonna go to box and I'm gonna actually ramp up the axis division or resolution to 50. I'm gonna disable the points now. I'm gonna tidy this up a bit by pressing Shift and L. And selecting those nodes. Okay, so we got a basic structure now. It's quite high poly because we're adding a lot more resolution to it. It might be a good idea now to maybe use axis align. We're actually centering this this mesh. Next, let's run it through attribute noise node. I'm going to enable it. We're randomizing the color. That's not what we want. I'm going to actually add P capital P. Or you can go here and you should be able to see this P as here as well. First thing I'm gonna do, I'm gonna disable fractals because it's adding some additional noise, which I don't want. And we're getting something like this. So what I'm gonna do now, I'm gonna maybe lower the amplitude to 0.5. For the noise, feel free to experiment with the noises. The best one I found that actually worked for me was the Vorley, I can't pronounce it, that one. And I'm gonna enable all 3 axes. So now I can scale it on one of the axes. I'm actually gonna scale it on a y-axis. Okay. Next, let's maybe turn that into the VDBs. Okay, so VDB from polygons, and we need a higher resolution. So the resolution I found that works best for me was 0.004. You feel free to experiment. If you want a lower resolution, feel free to just use a different value. And you can see we're getting a lot of jagged edges. So what I'm going to do, I'm just going to use VDB smooth just to smooth those out a bit. And maybe I'm going to ramp up the iterations up to 10. Okay, next I'm going to convert VDB to polygons. It's going to take some time because Houdini needs to calculate everything. So this is what we've got. If you have issue at this point, feel free to experiment with ISO value, just ramp it up and maybe disable the smooth if you're having issues with your mesh. Okay, next let's actually remesh it because right now I don't think it's usable. It's actually like 1 million vertices. So I'm gonna use remesh. For the target size, I'm gonna match the resolution I had for my VDB. As you can see here, Houdini is calculating the remesh, and it's still very high in terms of poly count or vert count. But now we can actually try to do poly reduce. And I hope we're gonna get decent results. I'm gonna change this to output polygon count so I can control the actual poly count that I need for this. It's gonna keep this maybe at 1000, which is default, and that's what I've got so far. Okay, so the next thing I want to do, I actually want to use taper, or maybe normals first. So normal, and I'm gonna go with maybe 30. And next, I'm just gonna use taper, linear taper. I'm gonna enable it, and if we try to play with this, like now, you can see we're kind of scaling this or using this taper on the wrong axis. So you have to scroll down to capture direction and use the y-axis instead. Also, if you enable this tool here, you can actually see what you're doing. So we're gonna taper between those 2 red gizmos. Okay, so capture direction, I'm going to increase it. Oh, sorry, from between the top and the bottom blue one. This is for the squish, which I'm going to show you in a minute. So let's taper the top and use squish here in the middle to get slightly different shape there. Okay, and the last thing I'm going to use twist, just to twist that shape a little bit. Okay, so this one's a little bit bent, if that makes sense. Here, for example, it just goes on a bend, and here as well, it's just skewed that way. So what we could do now, we could actually go to maybe our noise here, and we can play with the offset. So select some random value here, and it should give you a little bit different look. It's gonna calculate through all those nodes. So it might be a good idea to go inside this attribute noise like this selected, because we'll be operating on that node now, and maybe lower the, I'm going to actually lower the element size and increase this maybe to up to 3. So we're getting a lot more noise now. So maybe let's experiment with that value. Maybe 0.5 might be a good idea. So I quite like this. I'm going to stick it with this for now, and I'm going to go to our linear taper we created just to see what we are getting. Okay, it's like you didn't finish the calculation, and we're getting nice spiky shape. I think this looks quite cool, so I'm gonna leave it like this. The only thing I don't like is the bottom of it. I mean, this one doesn't look too bad, but I had a couple occasions when I actually had like a really ugly bottom part of this shape, so I'm gonna show you how to get rid of it. So let's bring sphere. I'm gonna use polygon. I'm gonna ramp up the frequency maybe to 30. I'm gonna run it through mountain. Want quite spiky shape. I'm gonna change this to positive. For the element size, I'm gonna go for the low value. I'm gonna run it through transform next in case I have to move it around, and I'm gonna use Boolean. So what we're doing right now, as you can see, we're kind of deleting that face from our sphere. That's not what we want. So in here you got subtract, change it to B to A, and we're actually erasing the our spike. And now if you grab the transform, select it once, and you can move this down a bit. So you can decide how much actually you want. Here also you can just put the scale maybe to 0.3 on or 0.5 on this axis, on the height axis, and just move it a little bit. You can also go to mountain, change the offset a little bit to get something more you actually want. Okay, I think this looks, it might look a little bit better. In my case, I'm not sure if I'm just gonna select taper. I think personally this looks slightly better. However, let's run with this. Okay, I'm gonna preview my wireframe. I think it actually might be a good idea to run this Boolean before we do the remesh. So I'm just gonna move this part up. I'm gonna plug it in here. Okay, and now let's try to run it through the remesh and poly reduce, just so we get a slightly better shape, and the wireframe as well for our mesh. I'm going to select the linear taper now. Okay, so as you can see, now we're getting this nice poly flow and slightly better wireframe for our mesh. Okay, so this might be our very basic projectile, and now let's try to do the complex one using similar methods. Okay, so I'm going to apply UVs on a later stage because I want to show you actually how to make a complex shape. So let's start with a line again and resample. I'm going to get again 5 points here. What I'm gonna do, I'm just gonna select those two we've created for P-scale and orient to get random scale and the rotation, copy those here, and just run it with these nodes now. Okay, and now I'm gonna use copy to points. It's doing some calculations again. Okay, so this is what we got. And now it's actually a good time, I think, to go back to our orient. And I think let's zero this. Or maybe this. Okay. And let's maybe change this one back to 1. Nope. So maybe let's leave those two, or maybe let's increase those, maybe to 0.1 minus 0.1. Or actually we can change those both to 0 to 1, and let's maybe add small value to those. So it would be 0.5 minus 0.5. Same with this row, and we're getting that kind of shape. So the next thing would be to actually use, I'm gonna use a point jitter to offset those shapes a little bit. Plug it in. For the point jitter, if you enable it, you can see what it kind of breaks our curve. So I'm gonna zero all the axes and pick the ones I actually only want. So that will be X and Z. I don't wanna adjust my height axis. I'm gonna lower the scale a bit and offset those points. And now you can see we're getting really nice offset on those shapes. I think maybe we applied a little bit high value here for the orient. So I'm just gonna lower it to 0.2. So we're getting a lot more details now, and let's run this through VDB from polygons. Same resolution, 0.004. Now maybe without smooth, let's run convert. And let's see if it's actually gonna work without the smooth. For the convert, I'm gonna change this to polygons. Okay, the only issue I've got now is just this shape is actually sticking out a little bit too much. So maybe let's go to our randomized scale here and go to options, and here we've got the global seed. I'm just gonna adjust this value slightly, and it's just gonna change all those shapes now. I think I want to go back to distribution, maybe change from 0.5 to 0.7. To the jitter as well, change the seed of it, so I get slightly better shape. Right, so I quite like this, although I think there's too much break here, so maybe let's try again. Nope. Okay, I'm gonna go with this seed. Now let's try to get some gamers and UVs for that shape. So let's do remesh. Gonna match the resolution. I'm gonna run the poly reduce next. Change this to output polygon count. Okay, so I quite like this. Let's check the poly count. It's actually 3000 vertices, 1000 polygons. I'm gonna ramp this up by 500 to 1500, just so I get slightly more polygon output. I'm gonna run it through normal next. Here you can experiment with the values. 45 seems to be a little bit too smooth, so maybe 30. I think 30 works best in my case. Okay, so I quite like how it looks. I think now is the time actually to get the axis align here, and I'm gonna center this one as well. I'm gonna check all the sides if it's slightly rotated, because it might cause problems later on. It seems like it is just a little bit, so I'm gonna run it through transform and try to rotate this manually, just slightly. Okay, next let's get some UVs. So what I'm gonna do, I'm gonna save my project in case it's gonna crash. I'm gonna run it through, let's run it through maybe UV project. And I'm gonna change this to be on UV2 here for the attribute. Go to my UVs. In here you can select your UVs. So I'm gonna go with the UV2. As you can see, we're getting like a side projection, which is exactly what I want. However, I'm just gonna rotate this that way, 90. Okay, so what I can do later on in the engine, I can apply glow to it and just to the front of that projectile, which is here. Okay, I'm gonna just leave this as it is because I won't be applying any textures on my UV2. So I'm gonna go back to my perspective view now. Save it again because it often crashes whenever I'm trying to create UVs. Next, I'm gonna go with auto UVs, labs auto UVs. Here, I'm just gonna use cluster and go to the UV viewport. I'm gonna enable it. And here, I'm gonna change this to UV rather than UV2. And this is what we're getting. So I'm going to reduce the number of clusters maybe to 2. And a good idea just to preview it would be to get the UV distortion, another labs node. And we're getting slight distortion, but I don't think it's a big deal because we won't be applying we'll actually be applying noise texture to it in the engine. Okay, so I think this is okay. You can play with the pack iteration. And I'm just gonna leave this as it is. I'm gonna go back to my viewport, perspective viewport, and essentially this is what we're getting. So the last thing would be to get actually the transform here, rotate this 90 degree to make sure that it's actually pointing towards the x-axis, which is this one. 90 here, maybe 90 here, and it's pointing the x-axis, which is exactly what I want. And I'm gonna leave this one as it is. And the last transform would be to increase the uniform scale to 50. Okay, whenever SideFX is exporting stuff to the engine, they're using a scale of 100. I find this a little bit too big for my meshes, so I'm usually exporting my meshes with scale of 50. But you feel free to either follow the SideFX suggestion or just, explore and find your value that you like to work with. Okay, I'm going to select those 3 nodes, Shift L, just to bring them a little bit closer together. Now we got this large, complex mesh, let's say. What we could do, we could go back before we did the UVs. Here, for example, I'm going to zoom in now. Or actually right after normals, just to make sure it's actually we're getting this mesh here, and we could apply another taper. I'm going to enable this so I can actually see what I'm doing. I'm going to change the capture direction again, increase it to make sure that it's actually at the top of my mesh. And instead of using the taper, actually I'm going to use the squish because I kind of need more volume in the middle here. Okay, and for the taper, I'm going to go for actually negative value, but for the pivot, I'm just going to lower it to the end to 0. And now what I'm doing actually, you can see I'm increasing the whole volume, especially at the bottom. Okay, so I'm getting this nice pointy shape. So play with the squish or with the taper. try to get a slightly better shape that might work for you. So I'm going to go with this one. It's got a lot more volume and a lot more details there as well. I'm going to plug it into the match axis. Going to go to the end, select this, press space F to preview it from the distance, and I quite like how it looks. It's got many details. I'm just going to stick with it for now. Okay, so where we actually, here we've got this match axis. Okay, we're going to use this for the other projectile as well. So here, I think right here, I'm going to zoom in. Boolean. So right after Boolean, even no, okay, so even here. So let's go with the taper, linear taper here. Before we do this complex one with copy to point, I'm gonna get the null here. I'm gonna call this one simple projectile. What I'm gonna do next, I'm just gonna run this through the graph we already created to get the UVs and the scale and rotation. Okay, so this is our simple projectile. Let's check our UVs if they actually been done automatically. So we're getting a little bit distortion, but that's fine. Let's check our UV2 channel. It seems okay, but it often breaks, as you can see here. So good idea if you plug the new mesh, might be to go to your UV project, initialize here, and press initialize. But I actually don't think it's done its job, so I'm going to select this and go to my perspective viewport and see how the UV has been applied. It seems like it's been applied correctly. So it's something that you have to experiment when you put this into the engine. Okay, so I'm going to go to my UV viewport again. I'm going to leave it as it is and check how it looks in the game engine, if it matches what I did actually. Basic idea is that I want this to be projected on the side, so if I apply the gradient to it inside of the game engine, I'm gonna get a glow at the front. Right, so let's go to final transform, which is the scale. And you can export both of those shapes. So I'm going to export this one to the engine, plug that one, go to UV, initialize, see if it's actually did its job. Okay, so it's exactly the same as it was. How about UV? Okay, and this one seems to be working as well. Okay, so that's how you get two of those projectiles. One is just a simple one if you need something a bit more stylized, and this one's got a lot more details. And both of those actually got the game resolution, which is quite low. In this case, it's 1,500 polygons, and the other one is exactly the same. So feel free to play with those settings, lower it further if you may be working on mobile, although I think maybe you should be able to even get that kind of resolution on mobile now. But again, it depends what your optimization targets are. Okay, so the first UV channel will be to get some noise to it and pan it across the projectile, and the second UV channel will be to apply the glow here at the front with the side gradient. Okay, so I hope you enjoyed this one. To me, it looks like some sort of ice shard. Obviously, the texture and the color will help this a lot, especially the FX in the game engine. Feel free to experiment with different shapes, different noises, and maybe a different amount of resample. So on that resample node, so you might get slightly more meshes, and maybe you'll get a lot better shape than I managed to create in Houdini. All right, thank you so much for watching.